Welcome to all of you. My name is Bilal Qureshi. I cover international arts and culture for NPR and write about books for the Washington Post. And I'm so honored to get to share the stage with Mr. Amitav Ghosh, and I know all of us are so excited about this as well. There isn't a more fitting stage for I think, your work in particular, because as many of you know, he's written novels that span the world. They are the definition of international. I mean, your characters, whether they're in India, Egypt, Burma, or on the high seas during the Opium Wars, are men and women whose lives span languages and boundaries, and are the ideas that you explore are carried by your prose and your gripping narratives. And this is very much the subject of the new novel that you're here. I think this is your first American talk about this book, is that right?
Yes, actually it is, yes.
Yeah, so we're the first port of call, as it were, for Gun Island. And it's a quintessentially Amitav Ghosh novel. There's a rare book dealer from, I'm not going to give away much of the plot, but I just wanted to briefly summarize it before we began, which is that there's a rare book dealer from Brooklyn who finds himself drawn into a mysterious myth of a merchant and a snake-wielding goddess from Bengal. And it's an adventure story that goes from the Sundarbans to the Grand Canal in Venice, to California, and onto the migration crisis that we're in the middle of now. And it's a global novel, but also a very timely and urgent novel. And so with that, I'm so grateful that we get to talk to you about this book and the ideas that have fueled this book in particular.
Thank you, Bilal. And I can't say what a pleasure it is to be here in this incredible festival with so many of you. It's just wonderful, and to be here with you, Bilal, is wonderful. I've been listening to you on All Things Considered for ages, so
sure, not that much.
Great to meet you.
Well, no, thank you. And I think with this book, I wanted to begin before talking about it, that there's an excerpt in particular in the book where the central character named Dean is sort of talking about his love of books. And I feel that there are often in a lot of your novels, I think many readers think this, that how much of this is about the writer, how much of it is about the characters. But in this particular case, a certain love of books is expressed. And I wondered if you would mind reading that section.
I'd be happy to.
I want to learn a little bit more about your road to writing.
Back in those days, there were very few bookshops in Calcutta, and their wares were far beyond my reach. Instead, I'd frequented libraries and second-hand bookshops. Reading was my means, I thought, of escaping the narrowness of the world I lived in. But was it possible that my world had seemed narrow precisely because I was a voracious reader? After all, how can any reality match the worlds that exist only in books? Either way, the fact was that novels had done for me exactly what critics had anticipated when romances first began to circulate widely in the 18th century. They had created dreams and desires that were unsettling in the exact sense that they were the instruments of my uprooting.
It's such a beautiful idea that the books kind of that reading can lead to sort of an uprooting, which can be a very positive thing as well. I wonder if you would comment on that or reflect on that.
Well, it's almost a meme, isn't it? I mean, like reading Nabokov, reading Lolita in Tehran, and I mean, they're like many books like that now. And I think it is actually the case that when you start reading books about other places, other countries, you get drawn into them, and you want to see them, you want to visit them, maybe you want to live in them even.
And your own background was you grew up in many different places as a young man. You lived in many different countries, and that has. I mean, we talk about being in the international stage. I think it's just a very natural and organic part of your biography, right?
It is. It is very much so. I mean, as a child, I traveled. Then again, as a student, I traveled. So, right from the start of my writing career, I wanted to represent this particular reality, which is actually the reality for, I would guess, like 80% of the people in this room. You're born in one place, but you live in another city, you travel, you go to many different places. There is a kind of, what shall I say, a sort of extended component to all our lives now, where we, bounce between places.
And you also began your writing career when you sort of moved into writing as a professional, after college, I believe, as a journalist. So can you talk about how that sort of informed how you think about even the novel, for example? Because I think a lot of your books, for many of us who are readers, find them they're full of information, full of ideas, things that we know you've researched and almost done interviews often on behalf of. I know that's the case with this book. So the journalism and how that perhaps guided you toward the novel or continues to be a part of your process?
Journalism, my first job on leaving college, and in those days in India, we used to leave college quite early, so I was about 18 or 19. And it was at a paper called the Indian Express. I started there in 1976. And that was at the height of what was the emergency, that is this period of dictatorial rule that was imposed by Indira Gandhi. So, and the Indian Express was in the forefront of the resistance to this. So it was a very exciting and thrilling time. We were constantly being raided by the police. We had all these sorts of bizarre things happening. It was an old-fashioned kind of journalism. I mean, it was really like print. You had to have these huge sheets which were bound together by things called flanges, and you would have to sort of set the paper. So it was in every way just incredibly exciting. And the habits of that time, just taking notes, listening to people, hearing what they say. All those things have been very important to me all my life. And I've been fortunate to be able to do a lot of journalism, even here in the US, for the New Yorker, for the New Republic. And all of that has been very important to me. And it's really been a major part of my sort of work and life.
Well, in 2016, I believe it is, that you released your previous book, which is called The Great Derangement. And that's not a novel, but it's a journalistic piece in some ways because you've reported it, you've gone out and researched it. It's also an essay. It's an argument about the role of artists in this particular political time that we're in related to the issue of climate change and how perhaps this topic that's always in our life and always in the sort of newsprint, as it were, is something that artists have failed to find the vocabulary or the emotion to be able to express. And it's really, you've basically made a call to arms, like a kind of a call to artists in a sense, that they have to address this issue as well. It's in our midst, and I wanted to ask you about that book and what prompted that and what you would say about this idea that you really felt we needed to think about.
It's interesting that you say that. When I published that book in 2016, and even earlier, when I talked to friends who are writers and artists, and I said, I'm writing this thing about climate change, they all used to look at me and say, climate change? I mean, what's the matter with you? Why are you even thinking about that? And, but since that time, especially I think around about 2018, I think everybody now knows. This thing is coming at us like an express train, and none of us, actually, it's going to sort of impact on all our lives in such devastating ways. The world we've known essentially has ended. We're living in a different kind of reality now. And I think the political upheavals that we are seeing all around us, that's a reflection of this changed reality that we're in. So yeah, but my book was not intended really to be a call to arms. I mean, if I were 20 years younger, I might have been an activist. But at this point, I can only be an activist unto myself, as it were. So it was intended really to be, if you like, an introspection about my own work. Because, I'm from one of the most vulnerable parts of the world, which is Bengal. In 2000, I started writing a book which is called The Hungry Tide. It's set in the Sundarban, that is this vast mangrove forest in southern Bengal. And this area is, even back then in 2000, we could see how badly affected it was. And in the years since, it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. So, around about 2014, 2015, when I saw how bad the news was getting, and really, if you follow this stuff closely, as I started doing, you actually know it's much worse than people let on, almost, you might say. So I started asking myself, why do I not see this reflected in literature, in art? Why don't I see it? Why are so few novels actually about these issues? And there again, the question is that it's not just that the novels aren't there, because actually there are many novels, etc., about these issues. It's about the wider ecosystem of literature. You may write a novel that is about climate change, but if it doesn't get reviewed, how does it matter? Nobody notices it anyway. And if you go back and look at all the major book reviews, like the New York Times book review, the New York Review of Books, etc., you'll see that they often deal with nonfiction about climate change. But fiction about climate change never enters those august temples of seriousness. It's as if you're writing about climate change, you might as well be writing about aliens or extraterrestrials or something, And that just sort of drives in on you the sort of hollowness of our contemporary idea of seriousness. Because what could be more serious than this? What could be more serious than this essentially a crisis of survival that we are facing in the deepest sense?
I mean, the thing I find interesting too is that as this debate around climate change has become much more of in our public discourse, I remember in even our newsroom, there would be a conversation sometimes that, well, who are the characters in this story? Who's gonna, if you're dealing with climate change, you're dealing with statistics and science, and you're dealing with creeping, numbers in the ozone or whatever it might be, or I remember in India, the air quality index became kind of a daily rhythm of your life. How do you turn that into a character would often be a question, which I think is something that I find in your essay, you dealt with this fact that people feel that these non-human forces can't be characters. They couldn't be imbued with sort of emotion and life that people think literature has to be about. And I mean, I wonder how you would deal with this idea that the way we think about it is that it's somehow a scientific and not a storytelling set of characters.
Well, let me say, first of all, that I think all of us owe a great debt of gratitude to the scientists who've often risked their careers to tell us about what's happening. But at the same time, we have to recognize that this is not fundamentally a scientific problem. I think it's one of the worst things that's happened in relation to climate change, that it's come to be conceptualized as a technocratic or, technological issue, whereas it's not. It's fundamentally a problem of culture. It's what we consume. It's what we want. It's fundamentally a question of desire. Nor indeed are the scientists the only people who are telling us about this. I mean, back in 2000, ordinary fishermen in the Sundarbans could tell you. I mean, I've been in remote parts of Indonesia where the farmers will tell you that, they can't farm in the ways that they once used to. So yes, I mean, the science puts it all together, but you can be absolutely sure that people who deal with the ecosystem, people who make their living from the land or the water or the forest, they've known for a long time, and they know today. They know the incredible urgency of what's happening. So really, I think it's such a problem that, since this everything in relation to climate change is always mediated by science and technology and so on, and by statistics, and that really comes in the way of our understanding of what it is, which is that it's not about that. It's about these supercharged hurricanes coming towards you. It's about these wildfires, I mean, racing from house to house. I mean, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the people in Paradise, California, they're getting their kids ready to go to school. And within 45 minutes, they're trapped in their homes with no escape. I mean, you just look at that, and it's not just California. Look at what happened in Greece. Those people in that seaside town trying to rush down to take shelter in the water, and they get absolutely incinerated on the way. They can't get out of the way.
And you have, in this new novel, Gun Island, translated a lot of this into a novel and into a character's experience and into his life. And it's an embedded and central character in this book, these phenomena that are happening. It's not described, there's never the term, climate change per se isn't used. There's not a lot of science, but we are in the midst of a story set against all of these forces. And I wanted to ask you about, you said it wasn't a call to arms, this idea, but you did introspect and decide that your new novel, which is this new novel, will have a much deeper engagement with this idea. It's not that your previous work didn't, but this is quite consciously so, it seems to me. I wondered if you could talk about your own decision to translate some of these pressing issues into a fictional story.
It didn't quite happen like that, Bilal, I must say. If you pay attention to the climate change stuff, you can't stop thinking about it, I was talking to Annie Proulx the other day, she wrote Brokeback Mountain, etc. And she was saying, she's also really immersed in the climate change literature, and she was saying that, again, she just can't stop thinking about it. She also says that she doesn't think that she could write a novel about it, which I think is such a pity. She's such a great storyteller that she absolutely should. But really, I'm also essentially a novelist, a storyteller. So when I started writing this book, all this stuff just came into it. I couldn't keep it out. If it's in your head, it'll come out. But again, let me say that I think of this book as not being about climate change or responding. I think of it as a book about reality, about the reality that we live in today. I just don't want to exclude those aspects of our reality that are related to the world around us, the nature that we experience. But there again, one of the weird things about our world is that we are in a world where the reality is uncanny. You'll remember there's a chapter in my book, a scene that's set in Los Angeles. It's actually set in a museum. And there's this wildfire that suddenly breaks out and is coming towards the museum. And you may remember that this actually happened with the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Suddenly a wildfire was coming, hurtling towards the museum. Well, I wrote my chapter 6 months before this wildfire happened. So it was so uncanny when I started reading, about this, about the actual fire. I couldn't stop following it, because I'd seen it in my head. And, so this kind of uncanniness that surrounds us today, I think that is actually the fictional terrain that we have to enter, that if you're going to write about the reality of our world, it's actually a changed reality, an uncanny reality. And that exactly is where this enormous fictional terrain lies, if you ask me.
I think one of the things, moving away from the climate change, perhaps, question is that the novel also does something that you've always done, which is that you bring our attention to, frankly, other ways of seeing something that we've been hearing about so much. So you take away, I think we're used to hearing about climate change here, maybe in the US, and as I said, in the context of the Paris Accords or other kinds of ways of seeing it. But in writing about Bengal again and writing about the Sundarbans again, you help us kind of see how there have been myths and stories that go back centuries of how people in these places have thought about their relationship with the environment, the fragility of that relationship, the precariousness of it. So can you talk a little bit about almost bringing us to, frankly, a very much needed other way of thinking about the climate crisis that we're in?
Well, let me say, first of all, that, one of the strange things about the whole discourse on climate change is that it's really very Western-centered. Very few actually non-Western voices are ever heard within this discourse, actually, even though we do know that, it's Asia that's really going to suffer the brunt of it. The second thing over there is that actually, by the time I finished writing The Great Derangement, one of the things that became clear to me is that this whole period that we call modernity, the 19th century, the 20th centuries, there was, until the late 70s, a fairly stable climatic regime in this period. And that's why, from the 80s onwards, this climatic regime gets completely disrupted. But basically, the structures of modernity, the imaginative structures of modernity, emerge within this period when everything is very stable. So what do we see? If you look at pre-modern literature, just across the world, everywhere, in pre-modern literature, the environment, the non-human figures in very powerful ways. You think about the Iliad and the Odyssey, the gods, the sea, Neptune, the serpents. Everything has agency. It has voice. It emerges. It erupts into the world. The same is true of the great Indian epics. The first part of the Mahabharata, it's all about man and snakes, And I think that's, the fact that in India we have these snakes and that I think people from the Indian subcontinent are haunted by snakes. It gives us a very special relationship in relation to the environment, I think in our ecological circumstances, nobody could ever think of, as it were, dominating nature or subduing nature, simply because you know that there is this aspect of nature which is utterly recalcitrant, which is the snake. I mean, it's always there. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So, certainly, if you look at pre-modern writing in the Indian subcontinent, it's just filled with all sorts of non-human voices that have agency, that have history-making powers, if you like. The same is true of, say, Chinese writing. If you remember the great Chinese epic, The Journey to the West, with the Monkey King going to the West, it's exactly that, So I think the fundamental problem from a literary point of view, when we think about how do we confront this particular period that we are in, is how do we restore the voices of the non-human, And in that way, I think really a great breakthrough was Richard Powers's Overstory, which was published in 2018, where really he's trying, he's trying so hard to give a voice to the forest, to trees, to the forest, And unfortunately, Richard Powers is speaking at exactly this time. Otherwise, I would have been there listening to him. But I've listened to some of his YouTube interviews, and it's very interesting. In some of them, he says, he wishes he were an animist, or he had been brought up as an animist, or whatever, or as a what is it? The other word, polytheist or something. And I always think to myself, well, I was brought up as an animist, so I can, for me, it is true that, these non-human voices are real,
Well, and your central character in the novel, as I mentioned in the beginning, sort of begins to dig into a legend and a myth that originates in the Sundarbans related to a goddess with snakes who uses snakes as one of, the book cover also has the serpentine form in the U.S. at least, and what I found interesting was Dean, the character, who is originally Bengali but lives in Brooklyn, is a very smart, thinking rationalist who, when he starts hearing about this myth on a visit home, is sort of rolling his eyes for a big portion of the book. The snakes, cobras, ridiculousness, this is the exotica that sort of defines India to the Western imagination, and he himself is sort of resistant to wanting to really take it seriously. And I found that a very interesting thread in the book as well, that you are a writer originally from India, writing to a global audience in a way. And I wonder if the idea of not wanting to both engage with these non-human forces that are very native and indigenous to South Asian storytelling, but not fall prey, I suppose, to easy exotica. Because I think that the book is really interesting in wrestling with the fact that we in the modern world are dealing with this tension between kind of rational ways of thinking and also that some of the things happening around us are truly absurd and we need other language to think about them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It is true certainly that in Bengal, some of our oldest traditions relate to this goddess. She's the goddess of snakes called Manasha Devi, and there's this sort of conflict between this goddess of snakes and this archetypal figure called the merchant. Shadagar, Chand Shadagar is what he's called in Bangla. That is the merchant Chand. And it's very interesting the way it conceptualizes this issue, because really, if you think about it, at the end of the day, what is sorry, I lost that. What is the issue of climate change in the end? It's really a conflict between the principle of profit and the principle of what do we owe to the natural world, to the world that surrounds us. And it's really remarkable to think that, thousands of years ago, our ancestors were able to, as it were, conceptualize this problem in such a clear way. Now, as you say, this whole question of, the secularization of the world, if you like, or the rationalization of the world. Now, look at this Mauna Kea controversy. I don't know if any of you have been following it. This controversy about building, an observatory some giant telescope on this mountain in Hawaii that's sacred to the indigenous Hawaiians. And the whole sort of, there's one kind of establishment saying, no, it has to be built. It'll tell us a lot about the world. And the indigenous elders in Hawaii are actually risking arrest and so on. Now, look, in the Western tradition, the landscape itself is never sacred, But sacredness attaches to built structures. Like, I don't think anyone would propose building a telescope on, let's say, St. Paul's Cathedral, or on top of St. Peter's, or on Stonehenge or something, because they're all built structures. But never does the landscape, never does a mountain, if you like. Maybe Mount Sinai, I don't know, or Mount Ararat. But very few are those actually are those sacred sites. But then look at what happened in Iceland the other day. One of their glaciers has just melted away. And they decided to hold a ceremony for this glacier, a funeral for the glacier. And I think this marks a very important turning point, because when you see within a sort of Western culture, admittedly a rather unusual Western culture, that of Iceland, the idea of, really the death of a glacier being marked by a ritual of mourning, I think it does mark some sort of important change. And I do hope that these rituals become more common, because they certainly are actually becoming more common now. Because, we have to recognize that there is something in our relationship with the Earth which is not exhausted by science or technology. There's something more in the Earth than just science, than scientists can tell us about.
I have one last question then, and we will take questions from the audience. So if you have questions, the mics are on in both of the aisles, which was that, you also in many of your novels, really geography and place is such a central part of your storytelling, and it's one of the things that I think is always wonderful about picking up one of your books, that you do get to go on one of these global, adventures often. Certainly the Ibis Trilogy, which is a stunning, piece of work. But they also feature, in addition to this deep regard and respect and description of the natural world, a great celebration to me often of multiplicity as well, and of multiple experiences of the world. I mean, whether it's a ship that is, I think, populated by people from all over the world who speak multiple languages, or even in this book, a kind of a very natural moving between Venice, Los Angeles, Bengal, Brooklyn. I mean, there's a kind of multiplicity that I think is very organic to your work. And I also feel that one of the threats, in addition to the threat that you mentioned to what's happening to our world, is to the spirit of multiplicity as well. Because it seems to me that whether it's India, whether it's the US, we're in a period where there's a narrowing of I don't know, whose story is the central story, and what story gets to be told, and who dominates and who doesn't. And I think that is something that I think your books also often present an antidote to. And I wonder how you think about that, because it's also something that I wonder if writers have an additional challenge to think about expressing, when it's under threat in a lot of ways. If that makes sense. I mean,
No, it makes perfect sense. See, again, as I say, it's the reality, it's the peculiar nature of the reality that we inhabit today. Look, Bengal, the language of Bengal is Bengali. It's the 6th most widely spoken language in the world. But, 30 years ago, when I first came to the US, it was very unusual to hear people speaking Bengali on the streets, or to hear Bengali spoken around you. And even in Europe, it was very unusual. Today, in Brooklyn, if I open my window, I hear Bengali all the time. Why? Because the people who work, the masons who are restoring the houses, most of them are Bengali. If you go to Venice and you look around you, you'll see the entire working class of Venice is Bengali. People often don't notice it because they don't know the language and so on, but I do know the language, so I do notice, and I'm constantly getting into these conversations, And this book really emerges out of this. What we are really seeing is this great displacement, a huge sort of churning that is not comparable to anything before, I would say, really, in human history. And how do we respond to it? We have to respond to it by understanding that the world is changing in such unexpected ways that we can't write about it with the techniques of the past.
Well, we have some time for questions from the audience. If there are mics, I think, in the aisles, or maybe, I don't know, is there any possible for anyone to hand a mic to someone? No? Okay. Well, I think we have, some time for it.
Well, there's a question.
Okay.
Is there any advice you have for aspiring writers?
Well, the first and most important thing that any aspiring writer can do is to read a lot. So I don't think anyone ever becomes a writer without reading. So if you want to write, you should read.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I've read
you.
your work even as part of my comprehensive exam list, so this is really great. So a question that I have is, I think there is a tendency that when you talk of modernization or secularization of the world, it is part of an imperialist project, and then there is a tendency very often to see that as something that came from the West that was done in non-Western places. But I feel like your writing breaks past this sort of East-West binary. So can you please talk a little bit about how you take a more transnational approach in your writing?
The first question, the East-West binary, yes. Look, I mean, in India today, the people who are destroying the sacred sites of indigenous peoples in India, that is, in the tribal regions especially, they're often, most of them are Indians. Many of them are vegetarian Indians, So, I mean, this is the terrible thing that we see. I mean, they pay absolutely no, I mean, when it comes to profit and belief, they're completely slaves to profit in the same way that people are everywhere else. This is the unfortunate thing, that this culture of extractivism, if you like, it's now global. People subscribe to it everywhere you look. And what we used to think of as other cultures is no longer a defense. It doesn't protect us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I have a question here. Yeah.
Hello. I'm quite a fan of yours.
Thank you.
I'm in the process now of reading The Sea of Poppies. And I'm interested because I love the way you use the language and how you've combined languages together. How did you develop the language that is being used by the seamen on the ships?
Well, that's a very good question. The technology of sailing is very dependent on language. Any of you who've read Moby Dick will know that you're constantly coming across all kinds of very recondite nautical terminology. So actually, nautical dictionaries are some of the earliest dictionaries written. I mean, they go back to the 16th century, 17th century. So when I started writing this book, I thought there must be some nautical dictionaries of the Indian Ocean. And actually, I did manage to find one such. So I didn't have to make up that language. It was the language of the sea in the Indian Ocean in the 19th century.
I wondered if you used Hobson Jobson a little bit.
I did use Hobson Jobson, but there were, there are several dictionaries like that. But this particular dictionary, the nautical dictionary, is called a dictionary of the Lascari language, and it was published in 1812.
Very interesting. Also, I appreciate the fact that although I can read Devanagari, I'm not very good at Hindi. I studied it about 30 years ago. I love the way that I'm able to now read it and say, oh, I know what he's talking about.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I have a
you.
question here on the right.
Yes.
Hi, I love your books.
Thank you.
But I would like to know your take on how Narendra Modi is changing Indian culture.
Where do I begin?
For those who didn't hear, we have a question about Narendra Modi and how he's changing India.
What can I say? The India that I see today is increasingly unrecognizable to me as the place that I grew up in. But, when I say that, people could very well say to me, well, it's just that you're getting older, places change. But really, the values that we were taught when I was a kid, most of all, the value of living with diversity, the value of living with people whose beliefs are not like yours necessarily, but who are your neighbors, with whom you live, and whose customs may be different from yours, but you accommodate each other in so many beautiful ways, If all of that goes, I just don't see what will be left of India except a lot of very large number of consumers. I mean, what else?
Yeah, on the left here, yeah.
Hi. So your last two books have had a very deep impact on me, including The Great Rearrangement and Gun Island, which I recently read. The one thing that has what left me confused after Gun Island especially was I understand the aspect of having the uncanny in the modern literature to deal with climate change, but also, as you mentioned, you're not an activist, but like the way to change it or to change the way the current political situation is, you need some activism aspect as well. So how do you balance the two aspects together? Like whether there can be a literary way of addressing the uncanny and as well as having the activism nature in it?
Well, first I should say that while I was writing this book, I spent a lot of time in Italy, actually interviewing recent migrants, especially those who've come across the Mediterranean, because I wanted to understand, this huge phenomenon of this Mediterranean crossing. So I spent a lot of time going to migrant and refugee camps and so on, and speaking to migrants. And fortunately, I'm able to speak to migrants because I know some of their languages, And so I do think that in Italy and across Europe, there's a very important stream of activism that's come into being. And I completely support it, and I very much admire the people who are doing that work. But I also do feel that this aspect of the uncanny, it arises time and time again, as for example in Hawaii with the Mauna Kea activists. They're not your traditional activists. They're not young people out with placards. They're your indigenous elders, who've grown up with a certain kind of belief. Now, I really think that, to understand this aspect of activism, we really have to look at indigenous peoples, most of all indigenous peoples, of the Americas, the ones who are now losing their homes to the Amazon fires, the ones who are losing their terrain to the pipelines in the north. And I think, from their love of the land, from their deep understanding of the land, we learn something. And that something is actually that uncanny relationship that they have with the land. Thank you.
Yeah, here.
Thank you for coming to speak with us today.
Thank you.
I was really moved by your essay, The Ghosts of Mrs. Gandhi, which I read 8 years ago in a high school class. And it's related to the question I wanted to ask you. What's the best way to write about the past? What's the best way to translate experiences and memories into words?
Oh my God.
A lot of, these are tough questions. I feel like I did not prepare. Like, these are legitimately important questions.
They are. See, that article that you're referring to, it's about the terrible pogroms that happened in New Delhi in 1984 after the assassination of Indira Gandhi, and I was there then, and I was on the streets, and it was a completely traumatic thing. It was absolutely traumatic. And I didn't get around to writing it until 7 years after the event. So it just sat in my head and percolated for a long time. And then finally, when I wrote about it, it was, I think sometimes you just do have to let time pass, between, so that it ripens in your mind, until it becomes something that you can recall in tranquility. Not that it was very tranquil recalling that, but I do feel that writing that article was a very important thing to do, because it was the first major article to appear, on this kind of, on the violence that happened then.
It sounds like you keep a lot of detailed notebooks. Is that right? I mean,
I had no notebooks on that.
Oh, you didn't? Okay.
No, I mean, in those days, we were out on the roads trying to deliver, relief supplies to the people who'd lost their homes and so on. So there was no time to keep notes. It was. So I didn't have any notes, and in fact, it was a memory I just completely wanted to suppress.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say thank you because I assign it to my students
Oh.
to read, and we just read it on Wednesday.
Oh,
so, university students.
Oh, wow.
And they are so taken with how people behaved in terms of protecting others without any prior organization or even speech. They just did it.
That's right.
And that really stayed with my students very much so. So thank you.
Thank you.
That piece was
Thank you so much. I do think that, it's very important, especially in today's world, that we remind ourselves of this, that when you write about violence, you should not do it pornographically. You always have to remind yourself that, in every circumstance of violence, there are also always people, often mainly women, who respond in a completely different way.
Absolutely. To protect others, yes. So thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for one last question and a last question.
Hi, I'm a senior in high school, and I read The Glass Palace in my sophomore year. We read it in class as a way to really understand the problems in India. I found it as a way to highlight the different issues in Asia, as well as to better understand my own culture, which is cool. And I loved your talk where you talk about climate change. And what is one issue that you would solve right now that you've highlighted in your books that you could do?
Well, if there's one issue that I could solve, it would be that I would really want to wake people up to this, to the great peril that we are facing today. And the reason why it's so hard to do that, is that we live in a world that's addicted to narratives of progress. To the idea that things will always get better and better and better. And that's why it's so hard, especially to speak of these things to young people like you, which is that, you're coming into a world which is, the horizons are drastically different from the horizons that I was born into, What you're looking at is a future that's going to be narrower, and more difficult in so many different ways. It's a very hard message to give because we don't have any way of communicating this. And I think that's, one of the reasons why, in some ways, a religious discourse often is important in this, because there is no religion that tells you that things will always get better and better and better. Everybody knows it, that often calamity awaits, that drastic things happen, drastic and terrible things happen, and you have to prepare yourself, psychologically even.
May I ask a follow-up question?
I think we're out of time, but
We have 2 minutes.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes. Okay, go ahead.
And how would you motivate your readers to take that issue and apply what they've learned and actually do something about it?
Well, I would say, really, for people of your age, just look at this young girl, Greta Thunberg, and what she's doing, and she just talks so much sense, so much of the time. Really, I think she's a beacon to the youth of today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And, thank you.